The debt situation in Africa is slowly creeping out of control. As you've mentioned, out of the 5 countries that have applied for the G20 Common Framework on Debt Relief, 4 of them are from Africa. This is Zambia, Ethiopia, Chad, and most recently Ghana. And there are quite a number of countries that are slowly moving towards that direction, including the country where I come from, Kenya. The situation is actually being made worse by the very slow progress in renegotiating with the creditors, and then also the kind of advice that governments are taking on by their development partners or the international partners is to continue trying to borrow their way out of this debt crisis, which is just not sustainable. So what is happening is you've got a debt situation that has accumulated over the years, not enough revenue generated to service the debt, and a set of debt relief programs that are advised on or premised on borrowing more in order to repay those debts. On the second part of the debt crisis that's affecting the continent is to do with the creditor landscape. So you've got a very diverse creditor landscape on the continent where you've seen many African governments, including those that have applied for debt relief under the G20 Common Framework, who have relied on borrowing from capital markets, taking on a lot more commercial and private debt, many of which that have a very short turnaround time frame in terms of repayment, but a very long window in terms of return on investment of that debt. And that makes renegotiating and restructuring the debt very complicated because you've got to take into account things like the bondholders, when governments issue Eurobonds and so on and so forth. You've got to take into account the interest rates, which many of the commercial creditors are very interested in. So the complication around the debt relief programs and why it is not working effectively for many African countries is that it's that complexity, the creditor landscape complexity. And also a third factor is when you apply for this debt relief program through the G20 Common Framework, your rating agencies or your credit rating worthiness is downgraded by the credit rating agencies. And so what this is doing is it is acting as a disincentive for countries to be very open and transparent about how bad their debt situation is tending to be at the domestic level. And my country, again, Kenya, is one of those where that it has experienced, I think, 2 downgrades just this year from the credit rating agencies. So it is quite a very deep, systematic and systemic issue and challenge that we are facing on the continent. I think there are 3 ways of doing this, and this is why the 4 Rs of this year's African Conference on Debt and Development become very important. It's about reimagining and rethinking the economic model that we have in Kenya. To a large extent, the government trajectory has driven towards a more service-based economy, one that is highly specialized, highly skilled, and tends not to employ very many people because we have a situation where the market education system is not responding to the market demands and the market needs. So we need to rethink our economic model and our economic strategy for transforming the economy, and maybe going back to basics and thinking about the more conventional way of moving from primarily an agrarian-based economy, which is what we are, to light manufacturing, industrialization, and then moving up the value chain in those sectors, because that is what actually leads to revenue mobilization increasing. That's what leads to research and development in improving productivity and building industries at the national level. But more importantly, what it does is it creates jobs and creates labor and absorbs the youth bulge that we have in Kenya. When you create labor, it means you're creating incomes. And when people have incomes, it means they can spend money. And when they spend money, businesses thrive. And that then helps with the tax revenue mobilization. So I think the economic model is very important. And to try and move away from this idea that we can only grow or develop or transform the economy through a service-based economy. The second thing is the political will by the government, but all arms of government, the judiciary, the parliament, and the executive, to really tackle the issue of transparency and governance on how public finances are being managed and how they are being utilized. I think the oversight role that parliaments play needs to be deepened, needs to be strengthened, but also needs to have a bit more bite and a bit more teeth in how they hold the executive to account and how they hold agencies or officials who are accused or found guilty of misappropriating or mishandling public funds. I think the gradual weakening of that ecosystem and of that system of governance in our country is actually what is exacerbating also the public outcry about the debt crisis on the continent, in the country, sorry. And the third and final one is about strengthening institutions, not by political appointments, but by technocrats and those who understand how to deal with the debt crisis and how to interpret how debt can be utilized in an effective and transformative way. Absolutely not. And actually, I don't think it's a government directive. I think it's an IMF directive to the government, and the government has passed it on to the National Treasury. If you look at the latest IMF program for Kenya, I think it's been presented there that they expect the debt levels to sort of balance out over the next 5 years based on the implementation of the proposals on tax policies. But I think it's very important for us as citizens, as Kenyans, to really understand what the tax measures or the tax policies the government is rolling out are about. They are not about revenue mobilization. I think it's very important for us to realize the tax measures that the government is implementing is about paying creditors, right? They may spin it as trying to raise revenue, but it is about paying the creditors. It is about ensuring that the government has enough money in the coffers to pay its creditors. And ultimately, that is what the advice the IMF giving to the National Treasury is aiming to do. It's all about satisfying creditors. This is not about revenue mobilization. This is not about the welfare of Kenyan citizens. This is about protecting the creditors, protecting the ratings of the government, and ensuring that the government can continue borrowing from capital markets, which is a very dangerous cycle and path that the government is going on. If you look at the tax measures, none of them are actually geared towards productive enhancement in the economy. None of them is about promoting industries. None of them is about building the manufacturing base. All of these tax measures are about taxing citizens who are already overburdened with the high cost of living, the high energy prices, and so on. It's not about facilitating and enabling transformation, manufacturing, and industry in the country. I think it's very important to understand how countries are rated when it comes to their ability to borrow on capital markets. Just like how we have the CRB in Kenya that assesses people's creditworthiness. We have credit rating agencies that assess countries' worthiness to borrow on capital markets. Now, in the case of Africa, what these credit rating agencies have done is they have intrinsically introduced a bias that raises the cost of borrowing or the cost of lending to the African continent. And when you do that, it already pushes lenders to think about factoring in those costs. And what it then does is it puts pressure on African governments to then make sure that they're able to commit and pay those debts at a higher risk premium or rate premium than would otherwise have been if there was a bit more of a fairer mechanism for assessing countries. And so this is why at the global level, there have been AFRODAD together with several other civil society partners have been calling for greater transparency in the methodology that is used by credit rating agencies, publication of the methodology so that people can analyze and assess what is actually happening when credit rating agencies are doing their assessments. And that is why also 2 years ago, the African finance ministers here in Dakar actually passed a resolution that they wanted to establish their own African credit rating agency, which is part of then establishing a broader African financial architecture that challenges the current one that is not working for the continent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.